Hello and welcome back. So we're going to wrap this up, this Pedagogical Training 1.0, with a quick review. Go over a number of the kinds of things we've been talking about in this series of videos. We've covered a lot of topics. We've hit a lot of kinds of things. Some of these may be review for you, some of these may be new concepts for you, but lots and lots of concepts, learning cyclic process, talked about learning objectives, Bloom's taxonomy, etc., etc. And what I want to do in the review, the approach I want to take in this review is to try to provide you with not necessarily a unifying concept, but a concept that you can kind of keep going back to as you think about these different things. You think about perhaps designing or redesigning your course, you think about learning objectives, you think about early feedback, the big idea, etc., etc. That if you're kind of confused about something and you're not exactly sure how to think your way through some of these kinds of things, something you can always go back to and say, oh, okay, I can take that and apply it to summative versus formative assessments of learning. Before we do that, I want to review for you very quickly Bloom's Taxonomy of Educational Objectives. And this is the revised version. So remember, lowest levels remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, create, and hopefully you remember what those things mean, what those words mean in the context of this taxonomy. And hopefully at this point you're perhaps seeing this when you go to sleep or something, because it's something we keep coming back to again and again, and we'll continue coming back to. We also introduced you the idea that many times people think of these as lower level thinking skills, these as higher level thinking skills. Sometimes apply is here, sometimes apply is kind of in the upper order thinking skills. It depends upon how you use, apply, or get your students to apply things. We also talked about the idea that if your students are working at these upper levels, particularly these upper 3 levels, if they're working on your content, evaluating, using what they've learned about your content to evaluate problems, to analyze problems, etc., that by the very nature of what they're doing, they are thinking critically. So all these things kind of wrap together. So there's a lot more than simply these 6 layers of Bloom's taxonomy and how you think about this idea of Bloom's taxonomy. We also talked about the idea that you literally use the words, the verbs, go back to those lists of verbs that are associated with each of these 6 levels, and you write out your learning objectives. Students will be able to verb, noun, phrase. So as an example, students will be able to evaluate whether a learning objective has been achieved. So they're working at this evaluate level. But importantly, remember that if you want them to be able to, in that case, in my example there a second ago, if they want them to be able to evaluate, then you must teach them how to evaluate. You cannot simply say, okay, here's the definition of a learning objective, here's a problem, now go evaluate that problem. You need to teach them how to evaluate that problem. All right, that was Bloom's taxonomy. Now, we also mentioned or talked about the idea that learning is a cyclic process, and I gave you this one of several ways of thinking about this the brain way, thinking about it in terms of how the brain works in terms of learning. It's not so important that we remember all the details of how the brain works. It is, on the other hand, as teachers, important to understand these other 3 components. The stimulus that we provide, which is a sensory input, what we ask the students to do in terms of response to that input, response by the student, and then especially this idea of the reinforcement provided by us, the instructor, to help that student start another cycle. So remember that idea that we have an impact on the student's learning process, student's learning cycle. We have the opportunity to impact that at these 3 points. Is there something that we can use as a tool to help us think about that? And the answer, of course, is yes. Bloom's taxonomy, our learning objectives. This is going to indicate to us what's the nature of the stimulus that we need to provide. What's the response we're going to need to ask for that from that student, and then what kind of reinforcement that we're going to give that student. So if you're thinking about the learning process and maybe kind of get bogged down a little bit, go back and think about Bloom's taxonomy and how does Bloom's taxonomy impact these 3 different points in how we as instructors can impact the student's learning cycle. We've also talked about understanding by design, or also called backward design, as we're thinking about designing or redesigning our module. Step one was to identify desired results. Those are your learning outcomes, your learning objectives, your learning goals. Step number one. Then, well, at that point, we then go back to determine acceptable evidence of learning. These are your assessments of learning. So these are when we talk about the summative assessments, the formative assessments. Just to remind you, we broke those down and distinguished between summative assessment of learning, or sometimes people call it summative evaluation of learning, versus formative assessment of learning. Summative is a real evaluation of learning, whereas formative is more about monitoring student learning. Summative comes at the end of the learning process. Think exams and tests and so on. Formative assessments come during the learning process. They're part of that process of learning. Again, these are the CATS activities and so on. These are all high stake, high points. You get it wrong, too bad. Here, it's usually low points, low stakes to the student. If they get it wrong, well, that's part of their learning process. And then the third component of understanding by design that we talked about was this planned learning experiences and instruction, lectures, discussions, and activities. Here again, as we think about this, okay, I'm going to redesign my module using these three components, these three steps, number one, number two, number three. Do I have something I can go back to as a tool to help me think about each of those? Bloom's taxonomy, well, that is learning objectives. That's the whole point of it. Those have to be integrated here. Again, as you write those test exams, as those exam questions, you're going to be using Bloom's taxonomy. You're going to be using those verbs and how you structure those. And of course, then Bloom's taxonomy is going to directly impact and indirectly impact the lectures, discussions, and activities. So once again, if you're a little bit confused about this and not sure, well, how do I take that next step to actually do it? Kind of keep going back to Bloom's taxonomy. How does that help me define learning objectives? How does that help me establish these assessments of learning, etc.? And then we also introduced this idea of integrated course or module design, that once you have it designed, it all needs to be integrated. These three components, learning goals, feedback and assessment, teaching and learning activities, so the lectures, etc., those things need to be integrated. And here again, right in the middle of all that's Bloom's taxonomy, learning objectives, etc. So we keep coming back to Bloom's. And then a lot of the other topics that we talked about, formal evaluation of learning, using rubrics, syllabus, lesson plans, and informal early feedback. Here again, we can keep as a tool to help us understand and think about these different concepts. If you're uncomfortable with them, kind of keep going back to Bloom's as kind of a foundation foundation tool in how do I develop those formal evaluation of learning. Those are your tests and exams. Learning objectives are going to be in your syllabus. Learning objectives are going to be in your lesson plans. You can use Bloom's in terms of thinking about how do I develop and actually write out those rubrics. And then again, informal early feedback, well, that's what we're asking the students on early on is, are we achieving those learning objectives? What are the exams like and so on? So again, Bloom's can help us adapt and make changes potentially in terms of our informal early feedback. The other idea, again, acknowledging that what we're asking you to do or suggesting that you do is make some changes, and that takes time. And we're asking you to integrate in classroom assessment techniques, formative assessments, and those kinds of things into your modules, into your classroom activities. How do you get the time to do that? We come back to the big idea, where you establish that for your module, and then decide of all my content, all the things I have in my content, my list of things that I talk about in my module, what's the basis for enduring understanding of the big idea? What components are the enduring understanding, provide that enduring understanding? What important components are important to know and do? And what are those that are only worth being familiar with? And you may recall that we talked about the idea, these are the ones you get rid of. These are the ones that are critical. And here again, what can we use to help us decide, well, what components of all the things that I teach are really part of this enduring understanding, important to know? We can kind of keep going back to Bloom's taxonomy and those learning objectives. Again, a tool that we can use for that. So Bloom's taxonomy goes way beyond simply remembering these 6 levels, remembering that they're lower order and higher order and so on. It infiltrates almost everything else that we're thinking about and talking about. Another concept that we've talked about, of course, and everything we've talked about comes back to this idea of student-centered learning. Remember, teacher-centered learning, we're talking primarily lecture would be the most simplistic way of thinking about that. Student-centered learning, again, activities, integrating a lot of these development of skills into your modules. And we think of this as a spectrum. And wherever you are on this spectrum, our goal is to get you to keep moving and thinking and moving in this direction of more student-centered learning in your modules and in your classroom. Remind you again, our role changes. Our role changes from what's referred to as the sage on the stage sometimes, or the purveyor of knowledge. I'm lecturing, just what I'm doing to you now, I'm just talking at you, to facilitator of learning. We become a partner in this learning process. It's a partnership in helping the students go through their learning process. And again, regardless of where you are on the spectrum, you're developing a learning environment. So which learning environment do you want? Do you want your students over here to sit passively and listen to you and maybe take a few notes? Or do you want them to be actively engaged in whatever it is that you're trying to get them to learn? Okay, what do you have to take home? We've gone through all this stuff. What do you have to take home when you're ready to enhance your modules? You are ready right now, going through all these videos, to enhance your modules by rethinking your learning objectives based upon Bloom's taxonomy, being very specific in doing that. Revising your modules by backward design and thinking about the integrated design concept, the model. You've got active learning activities that we've integrated throughout this series of videos. How to enhance your exam questions. You have a draft syllabus, or the makings of a draft syllabus. You have a makings of a draft lesson plans. You can feed off of those and fill them out and finish them off. You have ideas of how to get informal early feedback from your students. You also have some other kind of intangibles. Experience as an observer watching activities being modeled. So Chilan particularly was modeling some of the kinds of in-class teaching approaches that she was using and talking about. You have experience as a student participating in the activities. So you actually did that. So you know how the student's going to feel, how they're going to respond, and so on, because they would feel similar to you in many cases. You have a record of your experience in the pedagogical training through all the handouts and workshops and those kinds of things. The other things that you have are hopefully, lots of ideas, and I hope lots of enthusiasm now to go home and make some changes. I would suggest to you, though, that you start small. Do not jump in and say, okay, in 2 weeks I'm going to completely revamp my module. Start small. Take some of the things that you're most comfortable with, some of the ideas that we've presented to you that you're most comfortable with, and go back in and say, okay, this is how I'm going to integrate that in, and do it and practice it with, and again, very specific and concrete changes. And a word of experience, let's say, do not give up if it does not work the first time. I have a good idea, I have a good plan, and I tried it out in my module, and it just did not work exactly like I thought it might. Think about why it did not work, or think about perhaps it did work, and think, why did it work? And then make modifications from there. So if you have good ideas, do not give up on them just because the first time it did not work out quite the way that you thought it did. This is a process. You don't just simply jump in and boom, you've completely revamped everything. You can try to do that, but again, my suggestion is you start on a smaller scale. Okay, so we want to give some thanks to the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning, some of the folks that are making the videos and editing videos and so on, the Sphere project itself, your workshop leader, because you're going to have somebody working with you there on site, helping you navigate your way through the workshop and the videos and the handouts, etc. And especially to thank you for taking your time to come in and engage in this and listen to us through video after video, engaging in the activities, and hopefully going away with a lot of good ideas and concepts to help you improve your teaching and particularly help your students improve their learning. So thank you to everyone, and from Qilin and myself, good luck.